Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Devorah Margolin, and I am the Blumenstein Rosenblum Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute. Welcome to today's Policy Forum, Mapping Iranian External Operations Worldwide. Since the Islamic Republic's founding, the regime's agents and proxies have continuously targeted Iranian dissidents and journalists, diplomats from countries opposed to Iran's policies, Israeli and Jewish civilians, and other perceived enemies of the state, using external operations that range from assassinations to abduction plots to intimidation campaigns and surveillance. These violations have occurred around the world and have recently increased both in tempo and in brazenness, even extending to senior US officials. In fact, a story just broke yesterday of a potential Iranian-linked plot against President Trump. To help shed light on this phenomenon, we're excited to launch the new Washington Institute interactive map and timeline of Iranian external operations around the world. This open access tool is built from a unique open source database compiled by my colleague, Matt Levitt, and his team over the past few years, and it'll be presented here today. We're also joined by two esteemed experts, Magnus Ranstorp and Norm Rule, to discuss the phenomenon of external operations and the map. Before I introduce our speakers, a little bit of housekeeping. Following our introductory remarks from our speakers, we will open up to a question and answer session. If you're on the Zoom and you would like to ask our panelists a question, please enter them in the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching this policy forum on our website or on YouTube, please feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. I'm going to introduce our speakers now. We'll first hear from Matt Levitt. Dr. Levitt is the Fromer Wexler Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of our Jeanette and Eli Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. He served previously as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Treasury, as a State Department counterterrorism advisor to the Special Envoy to the Middle East Regional Security, and a counterterrorism intelligence analyst at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He's also the creator of the Iranian External Operations Worldwide Map, which he will introduce to us today. Next, we'll hear from Magnus Ranstorp. Dr. Ranstorp is a strategic advisor at the Center for Societal Security at the Swedish Defense University and a special advisor of the EU Radicalization Network. Dr. Ranstorp has been researching terrorism and counterterrorism for almost 30 years and was one of the first scholars to focus on Iran and its proxies, publishing in 1997, Hezbollah and Lebanon, the Politics of the Western Hostage Crisis. Previously, Dr. Ranstorp developed the world-renowned Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews and was a member of the European Network of Experts on Radicalization. We'll also hear from Norman Rule. Mr. Rule is a business consultant on the Middle East political, security, economic, and energy issues. He previously served for 34 years at the Central Intelligence Agency in various roles. He also served as the National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Mr. Rule is a life member of the Council for Foreign Relations, an advisor at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a non-resident senior advisor for the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a senior advisor at the United Against Nuclear Iran and the Counter Extremism Project. I'll now hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, Dev. Thank you for everyone joining us here live and for those who are going to watch later. In particular, really a very warm thank you to Magnus and Norm, two personal friends and people whose work I highly, highly respect in this area, for joining us today. Normally in these types of events, I shy away from using PowerPoint or anything like that, but we're going to break the rule today. So I want to show you some takeaway themes that if you dig into the map, you too can pull out some of these trends and ideas. And then I want to just demonstrate for you a little bit of what the map can do. After this event, the map is going to go live on our website, washingtoninstitute.org. It is open access and free. And I hope everybody delves into the map and it's the multiple things it can do. So with no further ado, we will share screen. So this project started in 2018 after a particularly interesting and dangerous plot outside of Paris, where an Iranian diplomat from Vienna, Sadi, and a few others from Belgium were caught trying to blow up, sneak a bomb into a Mujahideen Khalq MEK rally outside of Paris. And we started thinking to ourselves, does this represent an escalation? Has the escalation been ongoing? What does this mean? And in order to do that, we decided to start building a data set. I should state from the outset that while I am the creator of this project, the data set and the map upon which it sits, it's the interns, the research interns, and the research assistants here at the Washington Institute who did yeoman's work putting this together over several kind of generations or years of researchers. And I want to call out in particular Lauren Von Thaden, Delaney Soliday, and now Sarah Bashas, who have taken this to where we need to get today. We started with what you see on the bottom right, which is a basic Excel spreadsheet. We just started creating a list of all the incidents we could find that we could find sufficient sourcing for. And what we're looking at specifically here are assassination plots, either targeted assassinations trying to kill a particular person, more indiscriminate plots like the one outside of Paris where a bomb was going in to target either one person and maybe others would die, or perhaps intending just to kill a lot of people. We're looking at abduction plots, intimidation plots, and surveillance operations to support all of those. We went through lots of methodological conversations about what to include and what not to include. So, for example, we include cyber operations in the data set only when those cyber operations are about collecting information about where someone that Iran might want to target might be. We are not including in the data set, for example, incidents of Iranian cyber intrusion in Boston Children's Hospital or a dam in Pennsylvania. Those are malign activities, but of a different kind than we are looking at here. I should say from the outset also that we're very cognizant of our limitations. This is a strictly unclassified data set. And so by definition, there are source limitations. So we've gone to great lengths to make sure to try and verify every single entry. And when there isn't some type of court document or other source like that that we can make public to people, we have done our due diligence, speaking to law enforcement and intelligence and policymakers who can help us verify that something that, for example, we only find in the press really is the real deal. And what we've kind of zeroed in on doing here is to just ask the basic questions: who, what, where, when, and why? Who's being targeted? And there are actually multiple different plot lines that are using this target set. Targeting current and former American officials after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, targeting Israelis, targeting Jews who may not be Israelis, targeting Iranian dissidents and journalists, and in a few instances, just kind of targeting people that Iran believes are maligning Islam. Think of plots targeting people who are writing books that they don't like about, for example. We grew out of the Excel spreadsheet into an Airtable where we have 34 columns, 78 categories. We're really able to drill down as far as the information will take us to be able to study what's actually happening. So let's get into those questions. First of all, who are the targets of these Iranian external operations? And I should note that we're looking at everything from the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 to today. And then we generally also, when we're putting together these tables, also looking at the last decade to see what the most recent trends are. Here, dark blue is the past decade, light blue is total. You can see there's a focus on targeting Iranian dissidents. We include in there journalists that they consider dissidents, Jews, Israelis, diplomats, that can be diplomats from Gulf states, from European states, from the US, and West or Western interests. Out of a total of 95 cases in which dissidents have been targeted, 68 cases have occurred in the last decade. 54 since 2020. 63 of those 95 plots targeting dissidents took place in Europe. We'll get back to that in a moment. We're also interested, by the way, in who are the people who are carrying out these plots, because sometimes you'll see that they are using Iranian operatives themselves. Sometimes they are recruiting criminals, as we've seen in this latest plot here in the United States, the indictment that was released yesterday. Sometimes they'll use proxies from terrorist groups that they work with. There's a lot of different ways that they work with people here. Here we've mapped out the targets of Iranian operations over time. You can see the particularly high spike targeting Iranian dissidents in the past few years. But there's no question when you look at this, that this is a toolkit that Iran has implemented over time fairly consistently since the onset of the revolution. In fact, we only saw one area where there was a gap right after 9/11 of several months. I can't say for certainty because this is based on unclassified data. We know that there's material that's missing. I can't say with certainty that the pause was as long as we saw it, but there's no question that there was a pause after 9/11. Other than that, fairly consistently using this type of a tactic against individuals Iran perceives as enemies. Those perpetrators, we see different types of agents of the Islamic Republic, from the Ministry of Intelligence, from the Quds Force, people from the Foreign Ministry, actual diplomats under intelligence operatives under diplomatic cover. We see a very sharp spike, again, as we just saw in this most recent case with a Pakistani arrested here in the United States, trying to recruit criminals to carry out attacks, possibly targeting President Trump and others. Dual nationals from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Belgium, Azerbaijan, a long, long list of countries. We see use of non-Iranian citizens, proxy groups, criminals. And you can see on the chart here that in particular, when it comes to assassinations, at some point, Iranians themselves will be involved. Increasingly, use of criminals or some other type of cutout will be seen as well. What types of operations? In the data set, we have 101 cases of targeted assassination plots, 45 indiscriminate attack plots, 34 abduction plots, 91 surveillance operations, and 20 cyber operations. I should note that those numbers won't add up to 100%. There's a lot of overlap. Those 91 cases of surveillance operations typically match up with some of the other cases we're looking at here. But again, you can look at this graph and see that as you get into 2020, 2021, and after, a really sharp spike in assassinations in blue, cyber operations in particular in yellow at the top, surveillance operations, abductions, and attacks. The assassinations in particular that we've tracked largely occurred between 1979 and 1996. We have 30 cases within that time span. There are a few spikes in 2011, 3 cases, and 2012, 4 cases. But then as you get into 2022, 2023, there were at least 37 assassination plots. And one thing that we found surprising, anticipating that a majority of the plots that we would see would take place in countries where there's less capable law enforcement and intelligence, lax security, lax border controls. We've seen that too in Africa and South America. But these 37 assassination plots are not all, but largely in the United States and in Europe. We see all kinds of different tactics being involved, but especially explosives and firearms. Some cases where they've gone very simple using knives, and a small number of cases which appear to have been abduction plots, use of sedatives. We haven't seen a lot of information about the financing of these plots in the open source. There's some information on this recent case, for example. Of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't information about the financing. It's just not yet in the open source. Some interesting cases of using of false passports. And really interesting, a lot of these cases show some very significant and impressive capabilities. And many also show tremendously sloppy tradecraft. One of the most interesting and surprising things has been the where. And if you look at our circle graph here, you see 95 cases in Europe. You see a huge spike. If you look on the bottom left in the bar chart, in Europe, in North America, in the Middle East, in particular, in the United States. And I think there's a lot to be said here about the fact that Iran is not deterred from carrying out such operations, even in places where it might be more difficult to do that, even in places where the consequences might be greater, largely because the consequences aren't so great. And they are willing to go where the targets are. And they're willing to go and do things in places in particular where they think they'll have leverage. If our people get caught, we'll be able to get them out by, for example, kidnapping a citizen from that country in Iran and eventually trading them out, which is what happened with Asadullah Sadi, the diplomat from Vienna who was involved in the plot outside of Paris. So let me jump into the map for just a minute and show you some of the things it can do. I just want to point out that this is not entirely new. I date the spike in this activity really back to 2011, to the famous plot here in the United States where Arbab Siar, an Iranian American in Texas, was recruited by his cousin, a senior Quds Force officer, to assassinate Adel al-Jubeir, who at the time was the Saudi ambassador to Washington, at a very prominent restaurant just a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now, where members of Congress have lunch on a daily basis. And at the time, the director of national intelligence, who was General Clapper at the time, said that the Arbab Siar plot, the intelligence community concluded, shows that some Iranian officials, probably including the supreme leader Ali Khamenei, have changed their calculus and are now more willing to conduct an attack in the United States in response to real or perceived U.S. actions that threaten the regime. This idea of being willing to respond to things that they think we are doing to really threaten their regime, this dates back well before the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. But it's fair to say that in particular with that action, this red line, if you can call it that, is in the rearview mirror. So if you'll allow me to click into the map, when you come into the map, you'll have a landing page. We have a video here. We have an introductory essay that explains how the map works. There's also a tutorial that can walk you through the tools. We're going to click out of that. And I'm just going to show you some of the ways that you can do this. So first of all, you can literally navigate the world, scrolling in, scrolling out, and click on any of these dot entries. But we also have these widgets at the top where you can look at plots and attacks. And we have different categories: assassinations, an attack attempt, bombing, surveillance. You can look at counterterrorism actions that have been taken, foiled plots, judicial rulings, indictments. You can look at different contexts of finance and logistics. You can look at this and search by particular country. You can search by the different types of perpetrators. You can search by different types of targets. Of course, you can also just put a word of any kind into the search box, a name, a place, a keyword. And then we also have a timeline at the bottom where you can search either by time or layer these different search categories one on top of the other. So I'm sitting in the United States. So you'll allow me to just start. Well, let's click on the United States. And let's start at the very beginning. One of the very first incidences that we have in the map happened, again, just a few miles from where we're sitting. Ali Akbar Tabatabai, an official of the pre-revolutionary regime, is assassinated outside his home in Washington, D.C. If we go to the more recent events, U.S. intelligence recently reported it detected potential Iranian plot to assassinate Donald Trump. This was before yesterday's indictment. We now know what that indictment is about. And when we put that entry in here, which we will do probably in the next few hours, you'll be able to click on that indictment and see it for yourself. You can navigate the map. So let's look, for example, at Indonesia. And we'll see a case where an Iranian is arrested for conducting spying operations there. You can look at the sources that we've pulled for you. You can look at the entry. We can go to the other side of the world, and we can look, for example, in Peru, where another Iranian, together with some local accomplices, was arrested for plotting the assassination of an Israeli citizen. Let's just type in a keyword just to give that of course, I got to spell it right, give that a test. I'm typing in Olympics, and we can call up a recent entry where France was warned of a plot to target Israelis at the Olympics. This is an the Israeli Olympians being targeted in an Iranian plot. And then we can also do things like Let's look at surveillance activities. Let's combine that with the timeline. So let's look specifically at surveillance activities over a couple of years looking back. It'll help to narrow that down. We could even say that we want to only look at surveillance activities during a particular period of time in Sweden. We just did that. These are 4 incidences from 2017 to 2021, and then we can just reset the map and start again without all of those layered different searches. Like I mentioned, use of criminals is a particularly important trend that we're seeing. It's not entirely a new one. This goes back to 1992, as you can see. But if we go, if we look at it more recently, we'll see that there are a significant number of plots like that in recent times as well. Here's a case in the Netherlands not long ago. Anytime we have an image, you can click on that to get a better copy of it. And you can always click on the sources and see the sources that we have here for that. Let me just give you an example of the type of documents we have. If you go to indictments, for example, and we can click on any of these. We're looking at Ali Mansouri, arrested in Israel. You can go down to the sources, and you can, if you're interested, click on that indictment as well. So there's lots of different ways to search this. There's also a feedback loop. If you find that there's an error in the map, if you find that we got something wrong, we'd love to hear from you about that. I want to give a particular shout out and thank you to the International Mapping Corporation, which has helped us with this map. Our map on ISIS activities, Hezbollah activities, settlements in the West Bank. They've been fabulous partners. And I just want to thank all the people here at the Washington Institute who over about 3 years of really focused work have made a really, really huge and difficult research project possible and come to life. So with that, let me stop the share. Thank you all and turn it back to Dev.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was fascinating to get to see in operation. I'm now going to hand it over to Magnus, but I'd also like to remind our audience again, if you have questions and answer and you're in the Zoom, please use the Zoom question answer function. And if not, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Magnus, over to you. Magnus, unmute, please. Nope.
Not yet.
So close. No. Hold on. Apologies for one moment.
Okay, sorry about that.
Success.
Yes,
Thank you.
success. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, but also I want to congratulate you, Matt and Devorah and everyone at the Washington Institute for providing a fantastic resource on this issue. I think particularly it's been very useful when you go through and we have a sneak preview of the tool. You know, you are having an incredible resource in terms of seeing the helicopter perspective on Iranian basically proxy warfare, direct and indirect warfare that has been constant since the foundation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And of course, Iran have used this from the days of, when I say used, they have used violence, they have used terrorism, they have used different methods since the inception of the revolution. And I just want to remind those younger generation that, you know, when the Iranian Revolution occurred, there were 52 US diplomats that were held hostage 444 days. And of course, they the basic foundation was to export the revolution abroad to other countries, both directly but also by fighting particular enemies. The Iranians, together with Hezbollah, and perhaps Hezbollah is the greatest example of an organization that has been working on behalf of the Iranians in synchronicity with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds Force, with Soleimani and others, Iranian intelligence, etc. And they, of course, were also behind the twin suicide bombings in Beirut on the 23rd of October, 1983, and the killing of the 50-plus French paratroopers that occurred that sort of same day. So, this has gone on a long time, but to have the helicopter perspective of seeing recent plots, but also old plots, has been fantastic. And particularly in the case where I was involved, myself was Iran's responsibility in the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. I talked to the Supreme Court there, and very recently the Argentinian highest criminal court ruled that Iran was responsible for the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires and the 1994 bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in that capital. And what was really interesting also is that the resource is not just newspaper clippings, but you also have this 711-page ruling of the Argentina's highest criminal court that basically rules that Iran is responsible for these sort of different bombings. I also want to sort of raise the issue, and I mentioned this before. I was recently, together with actually Matt, in Israel right before the 7th of October massacre, atrocities. And there we listened to the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, who basically outlined that there was a lot of focus on Iran, but particularly that the Israeli Mossad had foiled 27 plots against Jews and Israelis abroad. And this has been sort of the constant issue in terms of the shadow war between Iran and Israel, but also, as we showed in your presentation, most of the individuals that are being targeted are Iranian dissidents, besides Jewish targets, besides Europe being a major theater for this type of activity. I just want to sort of focus in on a couple of incidences, which I actually mentioned in the database, that are illustrative, I guess, of what the Iranian intelligence and what the Iranian are up to in my part of the world, the Nordics. And in 2018, the leader of the separatist Arab struggle movement for the liberation of Awas was being surveilled by an individual who was selling information to the Iranian intelligence service in preparation for the assassination of the leader of the separatist Arab struggle movement for the liberation of Awas. This sort of continues also with undercover Iranian intelligence operatives who abduct a Swedish Iranian national who are part of this movement, ASMLA, when he is living in Turkey, and they are kidnapping him back to the country. But perhaps the most significant case that we've seen in recent years was the deployment by the Iranian intelligence, the Revolutionary Guards, of a married couple who goes to Sweden under false pretenses, under pretending to be Afghan refugees, and they begin to surveil Jewish targets on behalf of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And the targets that they are focusing in on is the chair of the official council of Swedish Jewish communities and two other individuals, which is an extraordinarily worrisome component. The difficulty for the Swedes was at the time also we had a Swedish national who were being held basically hostage, arrested under false pretenses, which meant that Sweden had to tread very carefully in relation to what it said publicly, etc., but also in relation to maybe perhaps harsher methods, harsher responses against this. And lastly, I want to just sort of raise one case that has come to the fore. The Israeli embassy in Stockholm have been under extreme pressure in terms of being shot at, there was a hand grenade found outside the embassy, etc. And this has been found that Iran is using these Swedish organized crime groups, two different crime groups, and one particularly they are focusing in on, called the Kurdish Fox, the head of the Foxtrot network, that they're using criminal networks to attack Israeli targets across Europe. And one of those incidences was that they directed very young people to shoot at the Israeli embassy in Stockholm, and that took place on May 17th this year. The fact that they're using these cutouts, very, relatively inexperienced, proxies, is a worrying development. But it's part of sort of the broader repertoire, which I think the database shows that this is part of how the Iranians operate in relation to different targets. And that is an extremely worrying development. So they're using proxies like Hezbollah, Iran, other militias, part of the so-called resistance axis, but they're also using criminals and others, and even more sophisticated methods to go after even U.S. officials, which I'm sure will be mentioned by the presenter after me. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. Norman?
Good morning. Deborah, thank you for including me in today's event. And Matt, I want to congratulate you and your team on producing a unique and extraordinary tool for the international community to understand the aggression from Iran and the threat to the citizens of many countries. This database is unique, not only because it's so comprehensive and powerful, but I must compliment you on making it so user-friendly and on applying to it the strong analytic tradecraft for which you were famous during your government and post-government career. And this is being put together at a level that frankly is rarely seen even within large government institutions. So it's impressive. So thank you for that. I won't repeat the comments that you and the brilliant Magnus have made. It's always a pleasure to listen to Magnus. His comments are enriching and insightful. But I'll comment maybe a little differently and say that when users of this database first open it up, just looking at the map of the world conveys a sense that this is an industrial scale global activity. This involves more than a small, tiny group of individuals. This is not a rogue element within the Iranian government. In order to acquire the targeting, the recruiting, the technical, the surveillance requirements for each of these operations, it would require resources that stretch beyond any single office or indeed set of offices within Iran's Quds Force or its Ministry of Intelligence and State Security. And that's important because I think many times in the world, the issue is raised of, is this a one-off operation by some crazy actors in Iran, and this conveys that it is clearly a tool of power projection and lethal statecraft. The second issue that is so clearly conveyed by this is the time frame. And again, tying into that geography, once again, you're looking at operations that had to be developed and were conducted during times when Iran had the greatest prospect for diplomatic engagement and of normalization of relationships with the world. It also shows that these operations are taking place in countries where the governments have often been so forward-leaning on engagement and willing to look beyond some of Iran's transgressions in order to build a new chapter in those relationships. And again, sadly, this demonstrates that engagement with Iran does not translate into a reduction of aggression. As you correctly stated, this is a list of public, overt reported actions. As Magnus has mentioned, and I think I can say that many other operations over the years have not been made public or have been defeated or blunted. So this is a broader picture that I think needs to be considered when we're looking at diplomatic engagement. Next, I think it's important to note that the personnel being used reveals how the world handles these issues. There are cases where Iranian officials are involved. The Vienna case, the case in France, is a superb example, and as Magnus has mentioned, in some of the Nordic countries. But often they're criminals or third country actors. And the international community consistently responds by treating this as a legal issue and not a state issue. And the response against Iran is generally symbolic or somewhat shallow sanctions. But really what you're seeing is Iran using a group of personnel that have no history and therefore are more difficult, or at least history in terrorism, more difficult for law enforcement forces to identify. The last two issues I'll touch upon before I go into a different question is the nature of the attacks and the nature of the tools tells you increasingly there are fewer and fewer red lines left between Iran and the world in terms of this terrorism. Indeed, you've got to ask whether, if there are remaining red lines, is it just simply they haven't conducted the operation to cross that? Many of these operations involve actors who would be using weapons of mass casualty, explosives. So inevitably, when you're looking at targeting one official, so let's take, for example, an attack against President Trump, former President Trump, he's so well protected that you could imagine an actor instead using an explosive in some way to get closer to him, closer to through that civil Secret Service perimeter. That inherently means that there are dozens of other people who would be involved as casualties in the attack, as you correctly cited during the Mansour Arbabsiar attempt against the then Saudi ambassador in 2011. This really comes down to a question of deterrence. And therefore, I think there are two questions that we ought to consider thinking about. And this database sort of raises these to me. The answer is, why is Iran doing this? And the answer is, it pays no meaningful price for these operations. The Western response remains thin. When action is taken, it's generally tough public statements. International institutions have not been active against Iran for many, many years. Russia and China have blocked Iran, anti-Iranian action at the United Nations for quite a while. And unless it's fair that Iran's leadership believes that the price for this terrorism will impact either regime stability or national and political and economic ambitions, we can't expect that they will have a reason to halt these operations. So as you look at these operations in this great data, observers should say, okay, well, if someone planned one of these tomorrow, is there a reason that Iran's leadership would say we shouldn't do this? So it leads to my last point, which is, what does this magnificent database tell you about the potential steps that need to be taken? The first, this is a global problem. Therefore, it needs a multilateral approach. And Russia and China are unlikely to support this, but Europe, which has been a tremendous target for the Iranians, and other partners need to put more focused diplomatic and economic pressure on Iran in a very meaningful way. But I think we need to go beyond that and say that we cannot continue to look at each of these failed operations or God forbid, successful operations is just the legal issue. It's got to be an issue that touches the leadership in Tehran who are managing this vast enterprise, assigning it resources, promoting the people involved, sending them out, authorizing this. And if not, it will continue. So I think when you're looking at these steps overseas, we're in the issue of we're taking care of the arrows, but we're ignoring the archer. And that really comes down to two issues. And both, I think, will be controversial. And these just represent my opinion. We need an international effort that is aimed at the eradication of the Quds Force and Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and State element responsible for terrorism and abductions as operational elements of Iran's government. There is no other government on the planet that has such an enterprise. And it is somewhat mystifying that the Quds Force has been allowed to exist by the international community for so many years. It is a terrorist organization. They happen to wear uniforms, with the exception of the killing of Qasem Soleimani. For the most part, we treat them as state actors, and that's unique. The last is going to be the most controversial, and I think it exceeds where we're going today, but looking at the scale of these activities and the potential lethality of these operations, we're in a lottery. We're in a lottery where law enforcement and intelligence have to pull the lever and get it right every time. And if they miss it once, we're likely to have mass casualties. And that raises the issue of military action against Iran itself. Now, we have self-constrained ourselves with a sense of this would lead to a regional conflict or Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. But you really have to ask yourself, looking at the scale of this activity, why is Iran immune from a military attack, whereas the United States conducted this, for example, against Iraq after a failed attempt to kill former President George Bush, and President Reagan conducted this against Libya after the actions in the nightclub in Berlin. So I think the scale of this problem sort of yells, well, what are we going to do about it, and why aren't we going forward? But I think that exceeds a bit of today. I just wanted to thank you so much for including me and providing this amazingly rich resource.
Thank you so much. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and start with the question and answer. But again, a reminder to the audience to either use the Q&A function or to send questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Already the questions are rolling in, and I'm excited to dig into this. Matt, I'm going to start with you. You've delved into this data. Can you gave us a little bit of an overview, but can we tease out a little bit more? Have you seen, any plots related to why Iranian attacks happen when they do? What potential attacks, a little forward thinking as well. Where we see certain trends and how we can see where something might pop up in the near future?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks again to everyone who's participated in this panel. Really appreciate your comments and your participation. So I've had the opportunity, as we've been putting this data set together, to brief U.S. and foreign law enforcement and intelligence policymakers around the world, multiple FBI offices around the country. And you're not the only one to ask this as the very first question. And so I've had some opportunity to think this through. And it really is kind of the sticky business. I can give you the data. How many attacks have there been in a certain place at a certain time? Trying to get into why Iran does what it does, where it does, is getting into hypotheses, which I'll give you some. I think it's quite clear, as I mentioned earlier, that the Iranians will go where their targets are. From the Iranian perspective, it's very symmetrical. For example, if a Western country allows NCRI or the Mujahideen Khalq to hold rallies on their territory, if they allow them to have a headquarters in Albania, they think it's perfectly parallel and symmetrical for them to be able to carry out surveillance or even plots against them in those countries, because they see them as a group trying to undermine the regime. I completely concur with my colleagues here. Without meaning to be too pithy, Iran does what it does, where it does it, when and how it does it, because it can. And because the consequences are basically non-existent, and when they happen, they are short-lived. I'll just give you one example. In 1992, Iranian operatives and some Lebanese Hezbollah operatives were involved in the attack at the Mykonos restaurant targeting Iranian Kurdish dissidents. 5 years later, an Iranian court found Hassan Darabi, an Iranian official, and several others guilty for their roles in the plot. And it specifically concluded that this was done at the behest of the Islamic Republic of Iran, etc. Right afterwards, most European countries withdrew their ambassadors from Iran. And Iran did then what is no longer at all surprising. Magnus mentioned it already. They immediately went and kidnapped tourists from several of those European countries. They held them under unlawful detention. The European countries came and said, "What are you talking about? These are tourists." And the Iranians said, "Well, perhaps you're right. Maybe we made a mistake. We'd love to have that conversation with you. Of course, we can only do it at the level of ambassador." And those ambassadors all returned. And that was the extent of the reprisal. But it was interesting to note how sensitive Iran was to this diplomatic slap. The Iranians do not like to see themselves as international pariahs. And so I think that there's a lot that can be done short of going to war, short of kinetic responses, but beyond a set of responses that to date have treated each and every one of these incidents as a one-off exception, as opposed to a trend that has continued over time, which I think this tool now makes very, very blatantly clear. These are not, no one of these is a one-off. And so I think we need to consider much more aggressive diplomatic sanction. The United States, the State Department has a sanction authority to prevent individuals and family members of individuals who are engaging in different types of corruption from entering the United States. Not just kind of very senior Iranian politicians, but some of the very people involved in these types of plots are sending their children to school in Europe and the United States, are sending their wives and daughters to shop in Paris and New York. And I think that should not be tolerated. You should not be able to oversee acts of murder abroad and then be able to send your family to study in schools in those countries and shop, etc. So I think there's a lot more that has to be done in this regard. And until we do, we shouldn't expect that Iran is going to stop, because this has been a very effective way to reach well beyond Iran's borders, to target individuals that Iran feels are enemies of the regime. And I think in recent years and months, in particular, the extent to which Iran has ratcheted up its targeting of Iranian dissidents, Iranian journalists who are broadcasting around the world and into Iran in Farsi, truth that Iran does not want permeating the borders of Iran, demonstrates just how much Iran feels at risk. I think that so long as the revolutionary leadership in Iran feels that the revolution is at risk, is under pressure, it is going to be more aggressive in the use of these tools. We should remind, there is an Iranian military. There's an Artesh whose job is to defend the borders of Iran. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the IRGC and its Quds Force, which are there not to defend the borders of Iran, but to defend the revolution. To the extent that they feel the revolution is under fire, is at risk, they will become more and more aggressive. And engaging in this type of aggressive activities, assassinations, abductions, surveillance, intimidation around the world, this should not be allowed within the borders of our respective countries.
Thank you so much, Matt. Magnus, Iran's often used kind of a distance between itself and its external operations, gangs, or other criminal networks, seeking to create almost a reasonable deniability, per se. How important is this tactic for Iran, and has this become more impactful over the years, and are they using it more?
Well, I think, you have to look at this in concentric circles. And I hate to go back to the Middle East and Iran's proxies, because we also have to tackle the Iranian support for these proxies. I know Israel is targeting IRGC, Quds Force, etc., in Syria and other places, it's quite important in relation to its security. And I think that we need to tackle their support to their proxies. That is also a major goal. And I think European Union can do a lot more in relation to that. But in relation to using criminals, etc., well, they will whoever they can get a hold of. And in the Swedish cases, they have gotten a hold of, they've arrested individuals, etc., who have a dual nationality, and they pressured them into conducting operations for them, particularly against the Israeli embassy. And I think it's important to of course, block this. But the problem has been that they have also taken, in the case of Sweden, they took a Swedish diplomat hostage who was working for the EU, and they used that as a leverage that we could not then respond forcefully against them. So that should also become condoned at the highest level and in a very sharp multilateral response against the practice of that. I mean, you just need to look at, Matt have mapped out Hezbollah's use of terrorism throughout the decades, etc. You just have to look at the record that Iran and Hezbollah together, through the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, have produced in relation to the atrocities that they've been involved with. They were involved with the kidnapping of 103 Western hostages throughout the 1980s that was resolved in the early 1990s. They never really paid a price for the attack against the Marine barracks bombing and against the French paratrooper bombing, etc. So, I'm in complete concurrence with the views by Norman that there is no deterrence because they're not paying any price. And I think that the United States and the European Union needs to be tougher on Iran because they are not going to change their way.
Thank you. That transitions into the question for Norman is what can U.S. government and Congress do to counter these external operations?
The idea that we don't know what to do would not be correct. There have been decades of very smart people who've looked at this with very smart European partners over and over and over. We know exactly what needs to be done, but there are some challenges. If you want to engage Iran on its nuclear program, then it's very difficult to have diplomatic isolation. If you want to punish Iran, then you can expect Iran to respond to test international fortitude, and that raises the specter of a broader regional conflict. If you want cooperation in one area, the nuclear program, then you're going to provide funding that's going to go to exactly these operations and regional proxies. You can't avoid it. This is what it is. Whatever you do against Iran needs to be long-term, it needs to be multilateral, and it needs to involve some very tough decisions. And I go back to my previous comment of saying that if we keep hitting the arrows, the archers have plenty of arrows. There are a lot of criminals, a lot of South Asians that the Iranians have sent, a lot of others, and a lot of hostages they can take. But you've got to raise the questions. Do we ban all international travel to Iran to prevent hostages? Do you undertake surgical military activity against Quds Force logistics sites or other sites in Iran to show what can be done if they go forward? We get lost in the consequences of this, and as a result, not only the issues that Magnus as are very articulately, elegantly presented, but Khobar, we understood that was also the Iranians. There's a long list of hundreds of Americans who've been killed and hundreds of foreign nationals, and we just don't really have a response other than saying, well, if we do this, it might be a war. If we do this, we have long-term sanctions. So I really go down to we know what to do. Policymakers just have to live with the consequences and be leaders to their own people as to what this means.
Thank you. We have only 5 more minutes, and so I'm going to end with a final question for Matt on the data in his data set, which is, does the data suggest what kind of kinetic consequences are likely to impact or have impacted Iran's calculus? Or do kinetic consequences just cause Iran to entrench further?
So I want to stress, I don't think that our only option is kinetic consequences. I think that has to be on the table. Norm is absolutely right. It's squeezing a balloon. Don't anticipate that if we finally do step up and put together a multilateral, multi-phased approach that uses multiple tools in the toolbox, that suddenly Iran is going to say, yep, that's it, we're done. They're going to respond in different ways. They'll try and ratchet up their nuclear program. They'll try and ratchet up support for their proxies in the region, targeting Westerners. They'll kidnap more people. They'll do a variety of different things. And that's why, as Norm said, this needs to be something which happens over time. And we stick to our guns and we show over time that there will be consequences to this type of behavior. The map does not show that any particular type of kinetic tool is more or less effective, because at the end of the day, we don't have a whole lot of examples to point to. We haven't used kinetic tools in response to this. It's not clear that if we did one really clear thing, they would just stop. The really only example you can look to is the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, which I do think had a very strong impact on them in the moment. I do think it denied them a very, very key person, including not only him, but Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, that complicated their efforts. It does seem to have prevented them from carrying out the string of attacks targeting U.S. forces in the region that authorities said they were going to do. But I remember at the time people coming to me from the Trump administration saying, you see, everybody said it would be World War III, that they'd carry out terrorism around the world. That hasn't happened. And I remember saying to them, just be patient. If we do something today, it doesn't mean they're going to do something tomorrow. And if you really think that the Iranians are not going to try and avenge the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, you got another thing coming. It doesn't mean they'll ultimately be successful. Maybe we'll thwart every instance. But it does mean that we got to prepare for this. And so I think we need to use multiple tools. I think designating the IRGC within the EU, showing the world, showing the Iranians that this type of activity by these types of actors is not acceptable. It makes them unacceptable actors. I think European countries in particular need to be able to get over the idea that if we do something diplomatically to Iran, Iran might have less diplomatic contact with us. Maybe they'll shut our embassy. Iran wants and needs that diplomatic contact with us at least as much as we need it with them. We should not be willy-nilly. We should not just go in and shut our embassies. But we need to demonstrate to Iran that certain behaviors, let's just start with assassinations and abductions and intimidation of dual nationals abroad, are simply illegal and unacceptable.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Norman Rule, Magnus Ramstorp, Matthew Levitt, for joining us here today, and to our audience for listening in. The event is recorded and will be available on YouTube and on the Washington Institute website. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dev.